So next we have a more regional update. Rob Johns, who I think used to present to the CFRU on a fairly regular basis. We're excited to welcome him back with Natural Resources Canada and a spruce budworm update for them. Thanks.
Thank you.
And it's just the arrows.
Okay, perfect. I feel somewhat obligated to give a bit of a PSA before I start. When I was coming through the border yesterday, I spent about 20 minutes in handcuffs in an interrogation room. There's apparently a Rob John somewhere in North America who is not a very nice person. So not sending our best. My crew loved it, so. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking, excuse me, I'm going to be talking about spruce budworm today from the perspective of New Brunswick. I won't go too much into the life cycle because I think most people understand it, but basically it's just one cycle per year. It overwinters in the L2 stage, which is what we were talking about, a little snowflake. The larvae feed in the summer, and usually around August, late July, August, you have pupae, and then the moths that are in flight. And if you look close at the damage, you can usually see something like this with that webbing, which is what the larvae create to kind of create a protective chamber, and little frass, which is larval poop on the shoots. And when you get really high levels of defoliation, you start ending up getting trees like this. So you get 4 or 5 years in a row, and you end up with these trees that look like skeletons. And this is around the stage where you're going to start to see tree mortality. So when we're talking about spruce budworm control or management, I think there's a misconception that budworm are difficult to kill. They're actually very easy to kill. The vast majority of them die over the course of the season from natural causes. Things like parasitoids, predators, disease, bad weather, toxins within the plant. The challenge is not killing spruce budworm. The challenge is actually suppressing an outbreak. And this is a different thing. It requires only just a small proportion of survivors to basically leave and start laying eggs. And like, how stark is this? The issue, the outbreaks tend to rest on a razor's edge. If you have 99% mortality over the course of a season, you have a population that remains relatively stable, relatively low. If you have 98% mortality or less, because they produce so many babies from a single female, you have a population that is going to start to rise into outbreak. And so that's what a fine margin we're managing here. Sorry, I deleted a slide. So just going a little, so the challenge is actually not that we're trying to control that 99% of mortality that takes place, or that 98%. It's adding a small sliver of mortality, 1 or 2% at the top end of that mortality to cause the outbreak. So going back just to look at a little bit of history in terms of how you manage populations, in the 1950s in New Brunswick, I thought it was really interesting to see from Angela's talk, there was so little in Maine because there was a ton of defoliation and outbreak in New Brunswick. And this was the first time that they tried to manage spruce budworm with an insecticide. In this case, it was DDT, which was widely available at the time. There was plenty of pilots coming back from World War II, so they had the planes and the pilots to basically deploy it. And this was really the first ever effort at a population or outbreak control strategy. And it completely failed over a course of just 3 years. Oh, that's the slide I wanted to talk about. So we're trying to add that little sliver of mortality. So the question is, why did population control fail? It's because populations tend to be very resilient when you kill individuals within that population, and they can bounce back. So in the case of that program, what they did was they targeted very high density populations. When you target high density populations, what you end up doing is actually reducing mortality for those that survive, because there's suddenly no more competition. This is one of the things that happens in a population when they get really high, is that a ton, like as many as 80% of budworm can die just through competition. If you're using these really broad spectrum insecticides like DDT, fenitrathion, some of the old school ones, you're actually killing budworm, but you're also killing the natural enemies that contribute that large piece of that pie in terms of mortality. And in the case of these, the folks that we're doing up in New Brunswick, they were also doing relatively localized treatments. So with DDT, they might still get 98% mortality or 99% mortality in these sites, but you have moths in the surrounding forest that just with really high densities that move right back in there with a year or two. And they move into spaces where you've removed the natural enemies and the local ecosystem that's controlling spruce budworm. So population control under this sort of framework is destined to fail. And at least back in those days, what they did was they said, well, okay, population control is just simply impossible. We are going to do what we're going to call this foliage protection strategy, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And that's basically, instead of trying to control the outbreak and stop the outbreak from spreading, we are going to pick our high priority stands, our high value stands, and we are going to use our insecticide to basically depress populations once the defoliation gets to a certain point. So we prevent trees from dying and prevent, like, ideally growth loss as well. And under this strategy, you're essentially letting the outbreak run its course. These treatments you're doing locally are not having any impact on the broader trajectory of the outbreak. It's going to run its course, they're going to run out of food, and those populations will eventually collapse. And this is essentially the strategy that was adopted back in 2006 when the outbreak started to rise again in Quebec. But there was also work running in parallel with some of my Quebec colleagues, Jacques Renier and Veronique Bartel and some of my colleagues, where they started to establish that maybe this population control idea, if we did properly, could actually work. And one of the key innovations from that work was this idea that there's these hotspots or this threshold. And all that number really means is that we learned that if above 7 larvae per branch, 7 L2 per branch, those populations are much more prone to continue to rise, continue to coalesce, and eventually continue an outbreak. Okay. So the idea is that you want to keep your populations below that threshold. And this was really the birth of this so-called early intervention strategy, which is essentially an outbreak suppression strategy. Now, we know why the previous effort failed. If we were going to do this in a way that's actually going to avoid those compensatory feedbacks that allow the populations to rebound when you use insecticides, you're going to target low density populations somewhere in that range of that 7 larvae per branch. Okay. There's no competition at this point. The populations are too low, so you're not removing that mortality factor by using insecticides. You use narrow spectrum insecticides, BTK, tebufenicide, things that preserve the natural enemies because they're not contact insecticides. They tend to be focused on the larvae that are feeding there. And you're doing what's called area-wide management. You're not doing this just these little patches that you've sort of selected. You're actually doing any of the areas where these hotspots appear. And if you do these things, you're much more able to add mortality into the population, which is the goal. So looking at some data, so based on the sort of research that the group had been doing, we initiated the EIS in New Brunswick, and this started around 2014. Of course, just like you guys have, we had the provincial surveys of looking for these hotspots. But we can look at what hotspots basically here. So you guys, I think, what'd you say, 600 or 700 you had for Maine? 300. 300. So New Brunswick has around 2,000 spots, I think, throughout the province, though it's really only the ones in the north that have really yielded anything. And so if we actually look at the maps, I've removed all of the data points except for ones that are characterized as hotspots above that threshold. You can see Quebec up in the north there, and you can see New Brunswick here. So 2016 was really our big sort of burst of budworm populations. We had a really big mass dispersal event coming from Quebec. And up in Campbellton, this is a picture one of my crew took just up in Campbellton near that second moth there. Carpets of moths in the parking lots. They were basically everywhere. And so the EIS basically took those spots and they built their map. And they created these treatment areas, which are represented in gray. So you can see one over along the border there and the spots. And even those little spots, those satellite spots, each have a little sort of postage stamp over top of them of treatment as well. And I was using BTK and tebufenicide. So in that year, 47,000 hectares. It was a pretty big treatment area. And we come back the next year and you can see most of the hotspots that appeared the following year are outside of that treatment area we had treated the previous year, with the exception of these ones, which were the problem with those ones, we think, was that they were treated much too late. So they were treated during almost the pupal stage. And because insects have to eat BTK, then of course BTK is going to have no effect on the pupae. But that's not a big deal for the program. You go back and based on the hotspot you have, including ones that appear in the treatment areas you have, you build your sort of area again around them. 2018, that was our biggest year of the program, 220,000 hectares. You come back the next year, this is looking much more like it. And you can look this with contrast up against the hotspots that are up in Quebec, right on the border there. Just for reference sake, that sort of blank area right along the Quebec border is very mountainous, so they don't do a lot of L2 surveys in that area, but there is definitely budworm there. Yeah, but even so we had a substantial reduction in the number of hotspots. But the way the program works, those hotspots get wrapped into another sort of treatment zone. And then we just continue playing this game of whack-a-mole ever since then. And you can see up to this year, and I think this year, do you remember what size of the treatment area is this year? I guess Drew will probably talk about it. I think it's about 15,000 hectares. Okay, so it's continued to be low basically ever since then. So one of the interesting opportunities we have is as we've been running this early intervention strategy in New Brunswick, and I'm just focusing on this area of northern New Brunswick where most of the treatments and hotspots have occurred. Right to the north is in Quebec, they're doing the foliage protection strategy. So we have this interesting opportunity to compare these population trajectories underneath these two strategies. I would like to clarify, though, this is not a comparison of the efficacy of these two types of approaches. Foliage protection is a very legitimate strategy. It's useful, but it just doesn't have any impact on population dynamics or on outbreaks, as we were talking about. But it makes for a useful contrast against what happens in New Brunswick. So on the left, if we just look at from the year when the first hotspot was detected in these two regions, in Quebec and in New Brunswick, in the left figure there, you can see just based on the L2 density per branch. And you can see over the course of 8 years, New Brunswick had a little bit of a blip, but it's maintained relatively stable at really low densities. Quebec has sort of gone through its upper cycle and it declined this year. I think it might be up a little bit this year after that. But you can see that's very different trajectories for these two different outbreaks, even with them being right next to each other. Same thing for the percent of sort of areas that have hotspots in them. For Quebec, these just kept rising and they're sort of still at a relatively high peak. So even the densities have declined a little bit lately. You're still having most of those areas with what we can characterize as hotspots, which are populations which are prone potentially to continue to grow, versus New Brunswick, which had one blip and is just maintained low. So that's interesting, obviously. But my group has been looking with a little bit more detailed surveys at some of the underlying science, like are we actually adding mortality? Are we filling that little sliver with mortality? And so we have a ton of sites with very detailed surveys that we're still working on, looking at mortality, we're looking at different insecticides, we're looking at other caterpillars and how they're affected by treatments and control and treatment areas. I'm only going to present just a small proportion of that for today. So the first question, are we adding mortality using the insecticides? Well, we can look at that during that larval to adult stage. That's when you're going to actually see the mortality associated with BTK. And we can see here year after year in our treated areas versus our untreated areas that we're only getting, the difference is only about 10% mortality, 15% mortality, sometimes even less or almost no difference you can see. But we are getting an added mortality, but the key point is you don't need a lot to get the kind of effects that we're seeing. There are questions within the program about avoiding non-target impacts. Some of my colleagues from Quebec and University of New Brunswick are working on this. So I'm not going to present any of that data today, but most of the work that's been done so far has found no effects that we can detect. And so the final question, this is obviously a big issue because spruce budworm disperses so well, is that mortality, we know we're getting that additive mortality during that larval stage. Are immigrants coming back in and filling that back in with moths? And again, we go back to we can look at some of our data from the Quebec versus New Brunswick area for this question. So on the left, you can see we're looking at population growth rates. So if they're above that line, that means the populations are growing. If they're below that line, that means those populations are declining. And so in the untreated areas, you can see, not surprisingly, based on the data we saw, those populations tended to grow, at least in 5 of the 8 years that we looked at. In every single one of the treated areas, those populations tended to decline. And what this tells us is that whatever added mortality we're getting during the larval stage is not being offset by immigrants coming in. So there's not enough immigration pressure, even with that big outbreak in Quebec, to offset the gains that we're getting from EIS. And if you look at the L2 densities in the bottom left, in all those cases, the populations are relatively low, but certainly in the treated areas, they're all below threshold, that EIS threshold, hotspot threshold. For interest sake, let's look at Quebec, where they're doing still BTK treatments, in some cases double applications, and look at what's going on with their populations. So you can see they actually get some additive mortality from their treatments, like the gray bars that are going down, and some growth in their non-treated areas. Okay, so they are getting some mild population impact, but certainly not as much as EIS. But what's most interesting is the population. You can see the population densities that they still have on average between 25 to 60 larvae per branch, right? So these are still in a full outbreak stage, even if you're getting a little bit of additive mortality, which is exactly what you predict when you treat high density populations. It doesn't have an impact on the actual damage. So just to draw things into conclusion, obviously results like this are very encouraging for an early intervention strategy. But prior to this, there was no indication whether we were uncertain whether it would work or not. There are still questions about these potential synergistic impacts of things like climate change and silvicultural changes, more black spruce, these types of things, and whether that's preventing further spread or helping give us a bit of extra additive mortality to prevent those populations from rising in sort of especially southern areas in New Brunswick. As I emphasized before, this is a complementary strategy to foliage protection. It's not necessarily something that can work in all locations. You can't necessarily access enough sites to find hotspots, and there's a lot of logistics and other things that make it so foliage protection in some cases may be completely appropriate. And we still have lots of outstanding questions. Can we outlast the ongoing outbreak? Can it be outsourced to other locations? Maine, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Ontario, which is what we're working on. And can we do it better? And my colleague, Dr. Sarah Edwards in the back is working on questions of, can we use less insecticide and still get these benefits and that type of stuff? So I'll thank my crew. This is still my picture from COVID, so everybody's socially distanced. We managed to make it still through it. And Sarah was running on the top left there, was running at the time. Also thank Emily Owens, who runs our L2 lab. She's also in the back there, and all of my other colleagues. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, sure. Anyone have any questions for Rob?
Sure. Who administers the EIS program? Is it DNR provincial, or is it more of a federal program, or?
It's a completely provincially run program. The federal government, like my group, are doing the research and support. Like we do a lot of the outreach, for example, communication with the public, which by the way, is actually a really important component of this program, is having scientists leading in front to talk about it, as opposed to, but yeah, it is run by the province. And that's the case also for Newfoundland, where it's ongoing, and Nova Scotia. So different jurisdictions are trying to make it work for themselves.
You're gonna stick around for lunch and?
Yeah, we're here
Okay.
through the evening as well. So we're not leaving till tomorrow. So if you have more questions, yeah, just grab me or Sarah or Emily.
Thanks, Rob.
Okay, thank you.